The cold came first. Not the kind that announced itself with wind or drama, but the patient, methodical cold that pressed down on northern Montana like a hand testing how much a man could bear before he stopped counting breaths and started counting hours. The thermometer nailed beside Garrett Ashford's cabin door read -15 Celsius, and the night had gone so quiet that even the pines seemed to be holding still, afraid to crack under the weight of their own frost. Garrett woke the way he always did, fast silent, with his right hand already reaching for the Glock on the nightstand, before his mind caught up to tell him there was no incoming fire, no Daniel bleeding out in the rubble, no mission left to save. Just the cabin, just the dark, just the 30th night in a row he had opened his eyes at 0300 because his body refused to believe the war was over. He sat up slowly, shoulders broad but narrower than they'd been 5 years ago, when the uniform still fit and the weight of command hadn't yet turned into the weight of absence. His face carried the kind of American masculinity that didn't ask for attention. A strong jaw, clean-shaven despite the hour, dark brown hair cut in a neat undercut he'd never bothered to change after leaving the teams, and a beard that had started to show silver at the edges where time touched first. His eyes, blue-gray and deep-set, moved through the room like they were mapping exits he already knew by heart. The pain hit next. His right shoulder, the one that had taken shrapnel in a blast that killed 3 men and left him with a medical discharge and a pension that barely covered rent. He rolled it once, twice, feeling the scar tissue pull beneath skin that had learned to lie about how much it still hurt. The cabin was spare by design, a narrow cot against the wall, a table with one chair, a wood stove that glowed orange through the grate, casting shadows that moved when nothing else did. Garrett stood, boots already laced, because he'd learned long ago that emergencies didn't wait for you to tie your shoes, and fed another split log into the fire. The metal clicked as heat expanded through iron, the only sound in a world that had gone too still. On the shelf above the stove sat 3 things: a steel watch with a black face that caught the firelight, a small wooden cross his mother had pressed into his hand the day he shipped out to basic, and a photograph he kept face down. He didn't need to turn it over to see Daniel Kozlov's face, 32 years old, laughing at something Garrett had said, standing in front of a Humvee with dust on his boots and hope in his eyes. The kind of hope that didn't survive the collapse of a building in a city whose name Garrett still couldn't say out loud. He touched the cross once briefly, his thumb finding the grain of the wood the way it always did. "Still here, Ma," he said to the empty room. Barely. It wasn't a prayer, not exactly. More like a roll call for the living, the kind you gave when you needed to hear your own voice say something that wasn't shaped by regret. The wind picked up outside, not howling, just pressing against the eaves in a low, sustained note that made the cabin feel smaller. Garrett pulled on his jacket, dark canvas worn at the elbows, lined with fleece. He'd added himself because the cold here wasn't the same as the cold in the Hindu Kush, but it still knew how to find the places where warmth tried to hide. He checked the stove one more time, making sure the vent was open so the fire wouldn't choke, and that was when he heard it. A sound. Thin, deliberate, wrong for wind. Not the frantic skitter of branches scraping siding. Not the dull thud of snow sliding off the roof. Something else. Something alive. A scratch, patient and purposeful, like fingers testing whether anyone was home. Garrett's posture changed before his thoughts did. He moved toward the door in the crouching glide he'd learned in Kandahar, shoulders low weight on the balls of his feet, his right hand dropping to the knife on his belt, while his left reached for the shotgun prop beside the frame. He didn't turn on the porch light. Light made you a target. Light told whoever was out there exactly where you were standing. The scratching came again. Softer this time, weaker, as if whoever or whatever was out there was running low on the strength to keep trying. Garrett paused with his hand on the latch, his palm flat against wood that had been scarred by weather and time, and let the moment tell him what it would. He'd learned in the field to respect thresholds. Doors were lines between safe and not safe, and crossing them without thinking was how good men ended up in bad places. He counted 3 breaths, then he opened the door. Cold rushed in like a living thing, stealing warmth from the room behind him, snow stinging his face in tiny crystalline strikes that felt like static. At first he saw only movement and dark. Then his eyes adjusted to the pale moonlight reflecting off a world turned white, and the shape at his feet resolved into something that made him forget just for a moment how to breathe. A German shepherd stood at the edge of the porch. Not stood, barely stood. She was large, even in collapsed black and tan coat dusted with frost, so thick it looked like ash, her ears struggling to stay upright through exhaustion. She had the disciplined stillness of a working dog, the squared muzzle and steady gaze that didn't waste energy on noise. But there was something else in her eyes too. Something older than training, older than instinct. Desperation, maybe. Or faith that someone on the other side of this door would understand what she was trying to say. She did not bark. She did not whine. She stood angled against the wind, her body forming a wall around four smaller shapes at her feet. Puppies. Garrett dropped to a crouch, moving slow, keeping his silhouette unthreatening, and that was when he saw them clearly for the first time. Four puppies, maybe 6 weeks old, their fur wet with melted snow and refrozen into stiff patches, their bodies drawn into themselves, as if the cold had tried to fold them back into the dark they'd been born from. They looked at first glance like they might already be gone. Their eyes were closed. Their breathing, if they were breathing, was too shallow to see. Then he saw it, the smallest motion, a tremor under black and tan fur, the faintest shiver that meant life had not yet been persuaded to leave. Jesus, Garrett said, and the word came out rough, scraped raw by something that lived deeper than his throat. The mother turned her head toward him when he spoke, and her eyes, amber bright even in the freezing dark, locked onto his, with a focus that felt like a question being asked in a language he should have known but didn't. She didn't move away. She didn't bare her teeth. She just stood there, shaking, holding her ground, and waited for him to decide whether he was the kind of man who opened doors or the kind who closed them. Garrett didn't think. Thinking was what got you killed. Thinking was the 3 seconds he'd wasted in Fallujah before pulling Daniel out of the wreckage, and by the time those 3 seconds were over, there was nothing left to pull. He slid one arm under the dog's chest and another beneath her hindquarters, feeling the weight of her 60, maybe 65 pounds, all muscle and endurance, and something close to collapse. Her body was warm in the places it should have been, and cold in the places it shouldn't. For a second, his boot slipped on the packed snow, and he nearly went down with her. Then his footing held. He carried her backward into the cabin, using his heel to kick the door shut behind him, sealing the storm outside where it belonged. The sudden quiet rang in his ears. He lowered her gently near the wood stove, spreading a wool blanket beneath her so she wouldn't touch the cold floor directly. She didn't resist. She didn't snap. She just settled, her amber eyes tracking his every movement with the kind of intelligence that made him wonder if she understood more than he gave her credit for. There was trust there, but it was the thin, desperate kind, the kind extended like a line he could choose to hold or let drop. The puppies came next. Garrett gathered them one by one, moving fast but careful, and placed them on a second blanket between layers of wool. He didn't touch them to the iron stove. Direct heat on hypothermic bodies was how you stopped a heart instead of restarting it. He'd learned that in field medicine, kneeling beside men whose core temperatures had dropped so low, their blood moved like syrup. He rubbed their tiny bodies with slow, firm strokes, working from the outside and trying to coax warmth back into limbs that had forgotten what warmth was. He wrapped heated water bottles in towels and tucked them near, not against their cores. He rotated them carefully, monitoring the rise and fall of their chests, counting breaths the way he used to count rounds in a firefight. "No storms in here," he said, his voice low and steady, the kind of calm that was contagious if you let it be. "Just a stove and some stubborn luck." One of the puppies, the smallest one, barely the size of his hand, let out a sound like a thread being pulled through cloth. A thin, fragile whimper that shouldn't have been loud enough to matter, but somehow filled the entire cabin. Then the sound stopped. The puppy went still. Too still. Garrett's heart kicked against his ribs. He placed 2 fingers on the pup's chest, feeling for movement, feeling for anything, and found nothing. 15 seconds. 20. He rubbed harder, firm circular motions over the sternum, the way you did when a heart needed reminding that it still had work to do. "Come on," he said, and this time it wasn't calm. This time it was a command. "Come on, kid, don't quit on me now." 30 seconds. Then a gasp. Small, ragged, but there. The puppy's chest expanded, pulling air in like it had just remembered how. Another breath followed. Then another. The tiny body relaxed into a rhythm that wasn't strong, but was at least steady. Garrett exhaled long and controlled and realized his hands were shaking. He turned his attention to the mother. Up close, the damage was undeniable. Her breath came in ragged bursts that steamed in the air. One foreleg trembled at an angle that wasn't quite natural, not broken, but sprained badly enough that weight made her flinch. Beneath the thick coat, he could make out the pale lines of old scars that spoke of restraint and hard use. And around her neck, hidden under matted fur, was a raw band of tissue where a collar had bitten too deep and healed into rope-like scar tissue that would never fully fade. When his gloved hand brushed her flank, he felt the heat leaving her. The cold was winning. He wrapped another blanket around her shoulders, tucking it close without restricting her movement, and she leaned into the warmth with a small, almost human sigh. "You did good," he told her, not because he expected her to understand the words, but because his own body needed the ritual of speaking to keep from rushing and making a mistake. "You found the right door." She flicked an ear. A gesture so small it might have been coincidence. Then she did something that made him stop moving entirely. She turned her head and pressed her nose to the inside of his wrists, right where his steel watch met skin, and held it there. 3 seconds. Not seeking warmth, not asking for food. Just touching, as if marking a coordinate only she and he could read. Garrett felt the contact like a question he didn't yet have language for. Warm breath against cold skin. The weight of a life choosing to trust him with other lives. The kind of moment that rearranged a room without making a sound. Then she withdrew, satisfied, and her eyes returned to the puppies sleeping behind him. The night wore on. Garrett did not sleep. He moved through the cabin in cycles, checked the fire rotate, the puppies monitor, breathing, adjust blankets. The smallest one, the one who'd stopped and started again, he would later name Maple, though he didn't say it out loud yet. Naming things had a way of making them permanent, and he wasn't sure yet if permanence was something he was allowed to offer. The other three he watched with the same measured attention. The one with the dark blaze along his spine, Ash maybe. The curious one who tested boundaries even in sleep ridge. The quiet one who listened before moving Clover. Their breathing evened. Color returned to their gums in increments so small they would have been invisible to anyone not looking for them. Outside, the wind continued its assault. Inside, time took on a different shape. Hours became breaths. Breaths became heartbeats. And somewhere in the space between checking vitals and feeding the stove, Garrett realized he hadn't thought about Daniel once. Not because he'd forgotten. Forgetting wasn't something men like him were capable of. But because for the first time in 5 years, his hands were too busy saving lives to count the ones he'd lost. By the time the world outside went from black to a thinner blue, the kind of pre-dawn light that made snow look less like grief and more like a page waiting for ink, the puppy's breathing had stabilized into something that felt like a promise. Garrett sat back on his heels, the first true exhale of the night, leaving him in a long, controlled release that tasted like relief and exhaustion in equal measure. The mother lifted her head, her amber eyes found his, and for a moment there was something like understanding in the space between them. Not sentiment, not magic, just the shared recognition of a line crossed and held. The cold had not won, not tonight. Garrett stood, his knees cracking from hours on the floor, and reached for his jacket. The puppies needed more than he could give them here. They needed a vet. They needed someone who knew what they were doing. And the dog, this dog, who had dragged herself and 4 dying puppies through a blizzard to scratch at his door, she needed answers to questions he was only beginning to form. He checked his watch, 0530. The clinic in town would open at 8, but Dr. Sienna Caldwell had a reputation for showing up early when emergencies called. He'd met her once 2 years ago when a stray cat he'd been feeding got hit by a truck and he'd carried it 6 miles in the snow because his truck wouldn't start. She'd saved the cat. She hadn't asked him to pay. She'd just looked at him with those steady brown eyes and said, "You did the right thing bringing her in." He wondered if she'd say the same thing today. Garrett loaded the mother into the back of his truck, first moving carefully, speaking softly, letting her set the pace. She didn't resist. She watched him with that same measured focus, as if she'd already decided he was worth trusting, and was just waiting for him to catch up to what she already knew. He placed the puppies in a box lined with heated blankets, making sure they stayed close to each other, and set the box on the passenger seat where he could see them. The road down from his cabin, curled through pine and rock in the town of White Ridge, lay at its foot like a held breath. He drove with both hands steady on the wheel, eyes tracking the road, the sky the way the light shifted as the sun tested the horizon. The smallest puppy made a thin sound like a thread being pulled through cloth, and he answered without looking back. "We're almost there." The clinic stood near the edge of town, a low building with wide windows that caught the morning and returned it in bands across stainless steel and pale tile. He parked, killed the engine, and sat for a moment in the sudden quiet, looking at the mother dog in the rearview mirror. She was watching him. Still, always watching. "You ready?" he asked, though he wasn't sure if he was asking her or himself. She blinked once. Slow, deliberate. He took that as a yes. The air inside the clinic smelled of disinfectant and something gentler beneath it, clean warmth, the promise of help. But our Sienna Caldwell met him at the door before he could knock. She was tall, without being imposing, her build spare in the way of people who walked a lot and stood longer. Dark brown hair pulled into a low, practical knot at the nape of her neck, a few strands already escaping as if they'd never agreed to stay put. Her skin was pale but warm-toned, marked by the fine lines of long nights and longer days. When she focused, a faint crease appeared between her brows, the only visible sign of the weight she carried for lives that couldn't speak for themselves. She wore a white veterinary coat over a gray turtleneck, dark scrub pants, and black non-slip shoes that had seen better days. Her eyes steady, intelligent, the kind of brown that didn't miss much, took in the scene in a single sweep. The mother's posture, the puppy's stillness, the way Garrett held the box like his arms were instruments rather than muscle. Hypothermia, she said quietly. Not as a question, as a map. We'll start passive rewarming, no shock. Her voice was calm, the kind that didn't rise even when rooms did. Two technicians moved in behind her, efficient and gentle, their questions few and precise. Sienna's hands were warm when she took the first puppy, the smallest one, and her touch was firm enough to be useful, soft enough not to startle a body that had learned to flinch. She checked Gum's temperature reflexes, moving through the exam with the practiced grace of someone who'd done this 1,000 times and still treated each one like it mattered. Severe cold stress, she murmured, more to the process than to the people. Light frostbite on the ears and paws, but they're alive. The last two words were not a flourish. They were a promise she intended to keep. The mother did not resist as Sienna examined her leg. Did not bare teeth when the old collar scar was revealed in the clean fluorescent light. She watched everything, amber eyes following each hand with the precision of someone who'd learned that stillness was a language more trustworthy than noise. When a technician approached too quickly, the mother shifted just a fraction, just enough to place her body between the puppies and the movement. Garrett noticed. So did Sienna. She's disciplined, Sienna said as if naming something she recognized. That kind of restraint isn't instinct alone. She slid a thermometer into place, read it, and didn't flinch at what she saw. Core temp 94.2. We'll warm them slowly. Heated fluids, humidified oxygen. They'll stay in the incubator overnight. Garrett stood back when asked, the familiar tension in his shoulders loosening only enough to allow work to happen. He didn't hover, but he didn't leave. He leaned against the counter, the lines of his jaw set, eyes tracking every step the way a man tracks movement when he's learned the cost of not watching. It was while Sienna prepared the incubator that the mundane details began to gather their meaning. She passed a microchip reader over the mother's shoulder with a small, efficient beep. Her eyes flicked to the screen, then back to the dog. She's registered, Sienna said. Garrett felt the words settle in his chest like a stone dropped into still water. Local, Sienna continued, her voice careful now, the kind of careful that meant she'd seen this before and knew how it ended. Owner listed as Dax Rutger, 247 Creek Road. The room went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with sound. Garrett's hand tightened on the counter. Vaccination history. Sienna scrolled. Her frown deepened, the crease between her brows cutting deeper. Incomplete. Last booster 8 months ago. No recent visits. She turned to face him, meeting his eyes with a steadiness that suggested both empathy and a boundary she wouldn't cross without cause. If the owner shows up and demands them back, this becomes complicated. The law favors ownership unless there's evidence of neglect or abuse. Medical findings can support that, but it's stronger if there's context. Photos, witnesses, anything that shows these animals were put at risk. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't soften the truth. She trusted him with it. Garrett nodded once. I know where he lives. Be careful, Sienna said, and document everything. The puppies were placed in the warm chamber one by one, wrapped in layers that let heat do its patient work. Their breathing didn't change dramatically. It didn't need to. It simply continued each breath, a quiet act of defiance against the night that had tried to take them. Garrett stood at the glass for a while, watching the smallest pup twitch in her sleep, as if remembering a dream she hadn't yet learned to hold. Behind him, the mother lay on a padded mat, a light bandage securing her leg, fluids dripping steadily into her vein. Her breathing had eased into something closer to normal. She lifted her head when Garrett approached, amber eyes tracking his movement the way a compass tracks north. He knelt beside her, careful to keep his presence calm and unthreatening. You did good, he said, words chosen not for poetry but for accuracy. We'll figure the rest out. She held his gaze for a long moment, amber eyes steady, then turned her attention back to the door behind which her puppies slept. A small gesture that felt less like dismissal and more like trust. She chose you, Sienna said quietly. Garrett didn't answer. He didn't know how. Outside, the sun was fully up now, turning snow into light and shadow, and the town of White Ridge was waking to a day that didn't yet know what had happened in the coldest hours. But Garrett knew, and the dog knew. And somewhere on Creek Road, a man named Dax Rutger was about to learn that some doors once opened changed everything that came after. Garrett stood his knees protesting the cold floor and met Sienna's eyes. "I'm going to Creek Road," and he said. "I need to see where she came from." Sienna nodded. "And if he's there, then we'll have that conversation," Garrett said. His voice was quiet, final. The voice of a man who'd spent too many years following orders and not enough years deciding what was right. "But first I need to know what I'm protecting them from." He walked to the door, paused, looked back at the incubator where 4 tiny lives were deciding whether the world was worth staying in. The mother watched him go, her amber eyes holding his until the door closed between them. The cold hit him again when he stepped outside, but this time it felt different. Less like an enemy, more like a fact to be acknowledged and then set aside. He had work to do, and for the first time in 5 years, the work felt like it might actually mean something. The road to Creek Road was not a road so much as a suggestion, gravel and frozen mud that wound north along the spine of the valley where civilization thinned into something older and less forgiving. Garrett drove with the windows cracked despite the cold, letting the air keep him sharp, letting the silence do what silence always did when you gave it space. It clarified. It stripped away the noise until all that remained were the questions that mattered. Why had the dog come to his door specifically? How far had she walked through a blizzard with 4 newborns and a damaged leg? And what kind of man left animals in conditions that made death by freezing the more merciful option? The sun sat low and pale on the horizon, turning the landscape into a study of whites and grays, shadows pooling in the hollows between snowdrifts like ink spilled across paper. Garrett passed the turnoff for Ruth Palmer's place, a small cabin with smoke rising thin and steady from the chimney, and continued another half-mile until the warehouse came into view. It squatted at the edge of the tree line like something that had given up pretending to be useful. Sheet metal siding streaked with rust, a sagging roofline that looked one heavy snow away from collapse, windows boarded over or broken, the glass scattered in the snow like teeth. The kind of place that existed in the margins of maps, noticed only when something went wrong enough to require an address. Garrett parked where his tire tracks wouldn't be obvious from the road and stepped out into the kind of cold that made breathing feel like work. He moved toward the building the way men do who have learned that the first thing a place will give you is what it wants you to see. He did not take that gift. He took his time. The door hung half open on hinges that had rusted into permanent surrender. Garrett pushed it wider with his boot, the metal scraping across concrete in a sound that echoed too loud in the morning quiet. The smell hit him before his eyes adjusted to the dim interior, damp straw-cold metal, and beneath it all, the sour edge of neglect. The smell of things left to rot because no one cared enough to stop them. Inside the warehouse was a single large space empty except for the evidence of what it had been used for. Straw lay scattered across the floor in clumps flattened in a wide oval near the back wall, as if a body had curled there repeatedly trying to conserve heat in a space that had none to offer. A metal bowl lay on its side, a film of ice locking the last water into a useless shape. Near the wall, a length of chain lay half buried in chaff, its links orange with rust, the end fitted with a clasp that had been opened and closed too many times to be gentle anymore. Garrett knelt in the straw, the cold pressed through his jeans, finding the knee that still ached when the weather turned. He photographed everything, the bowl against the floorboards, the straw against the wall, the chain against his glove for scale. He did not rush. Rushing was how you missed the details that mattered later when a judge asked whether you were certain about what you saw. The temperature probe in his jacket pocket read -10 Celsius. He photographed the reading, marked the location on his phone, and stood slowly, his breath visible in the air, like a reminder that living things were not meant to survive here. Against the back wall, water stains marked where snow had blown through gaps in the siding, melting and refreezing in layers that turned the wood dark. Garrett ran his gloved hand along the surface and felt the splinters catch rough and uncared for. Near the base, something else caught his eye, scratches in the wood-thin parallel lines that could have been claws. Lots of them. Clustered near the door as if something had spent hours, maybe days, trying to get out. He photographed those too. Outside, he circled the building, eyes on the ground. Snow still held the night's language, the scuff of boots, the long drag of something heavy, a series of paw prints that began at the door and angled toward the creek before disappearing into deeper drifts. Garrett followed them as far as he could past the tree line to where the bank dipped and the ice had been broken recently. Dark water licked at the edges, patient and cold. A man had stood here, he thought, and a dog had turned back. He did not need to imagine the rest. He had seen enough in other places to understand how neglect worked. It did not announce itself with cruelty alone. Sometimes it was simply the absence of care repeated until absence became harm. A voice behind him startled the quiet. "You're not hunting, are you?" Garrett turned, hand-dropping instinctively toward his belt before he recognized the shape as non-threatening. An older woman stood at the edge of the tree line, bundled in a quilted coat the color of faded denim, a knit cap pulled low over silver hair that escaped in soft curls around her ears. Her face was narrow lines etched by winters rather than worry, and her eyes were sharp with the kind of kindness that did not mistake itself for permission. "I saw your truck," she said, moving closer with the careful steps of someone who knew how ice hid under snow. "Figured I'd ask before the rumors did." Garrett introduced himself, kept it simple. She nodded the way people do when they already know a story and are just waiting to see if you do too. "Ruth Palmer," she said. "I've lived up the bend since before that place was a place." She gestured with a mittened hand toward the warehouse. "Belongs to Dax, or used to. He comes and goes, mostly goes." Her mouth tightened, not in anger, but in a kind of weary accounting. "I heard them. Nights like last night. Not barking, just small sounds, like someone trying not to be heard." Garrett did not interrupt. He let the space do what it needed to do. "I brought soup once," Ruth continued, her voice softer now, as if the memory still carried weight. "Knocked, no answer. Left it by the door. It was still there the next day, frozen solid." She shook her head. "You can tell when a place isn't being tended, even the snow knows." Garrett asked if she would be willing to say this again later to someone who would write it down. Ruth studied his face, measuring whether he would carry the words carefully. "If it helps those animals," she said, "I'll say it twice." He returned to the interior of the warehouse, guided now by the certainty that comes when a story begins to align. He took close-ups of the wall where the chain had scraped, leaving marks in the wood like tally marks for days survived. He documented the bowl again this time, with a ruler placed beside it for reference. He bagged a length of the rusted chain, noting the fur still caught in one of the links, brown and black and matted with something that might have been blood. Outside, the creek murmured under ice, the sound of movement beneath restraint. Outside, Ruth watched from a distance, one mitten pressed to her mouth. When he joined her, she was already speaking before he could ask. "I always thought there was more back there," she said quietly. "More than just one dog." Garrett did not trust his voice yet. He trusted the evidence. He nodded once, and Ruth nodded back, and in that exchange was the understanding that some truths did not need to be spoken aloud to be known. The drive back to town took 20 minutes, but Garrett's mind covered years. He thought about the scars on the dog's neck, the way she had stood in the blizzard shielding puppies she should not have been able to keep alive. Ruth's words about more than one dog, as if the warehouse had held other stories that no one would ever hear. He thought about Daniel trapped under concrete in a city half a world away, and how Garrett had hesitated for 3 seconds, just 3, before making the decision to pull him out, and how those 3 seconds had been 3 seconds too many. How Daniel's last words had been, "Don't let it be meaningless, brother," and how Garrett had spent 5 years trying to figure out what it meant to honor a request from a dead man. Maybe this was it. Maybe meaning was not some grand gesture written in policy and medals. Maybe it was just showing up when a door got scratched in the middle of a blizzard and deciding that this time, this one time, you would not hesitate. The gas station sat at the intersection of Route 9 and Hollow Road, a bright island against the snow fluorescent lights, buzzing behind plate glass windows that advertised coffee and diesel, and the kinds of snacks that tasted like regret. Garrett parked near the propane tanks and went inside where warmth hummed, and the clerk, a young man with a tired face and a beard that had not been trimmed in weeks, looked up with the practiced neutrality of someone who had learned not to ask questions unless the answers were necessary. "Can I help you?" Garrett asked about security footage. The clerk shrugged, leaned back against the counter. "Depends what you need." Garrett explained enough: an animal, a storm, a timeline that mattered. The clerk's expression shifted, something like recognition flickering behind the caution. "We had a guy in here late," he said. "Night of the blizzard. Bought whiskey. Said his truck wouldn't start into the cold." He paused as if deciding how much to say. Name on the card was Rutger. The clerk turned the monitor so Garrett could see. The footage was grainy, time-stamped 0017 on January 15th, the night of the blizzard. A man in a heavy brown coat stood at the counter, shoulders sagging under more than weather jaw, unshaven eyes dulled by exhaustion or drink or both. He paid, left, returned 3 minutes later for a second bottle. On the way out, he paused, looking past the glass as if the dark itself were a mirror, showing him something he did not want to see. Garrett saved the clip, noted the time, the angle, the sequence. It was not a confession. It was better. It was a piece that fit. By the time he returned to his cabin, the light had begun to slip the blue thinning toward gray. He walked the perimeter once more in his mind, marking the places where snow had been disturbed, where something heavy had been dragged. He did not let anger take the lead. Anger was loud, and what he needed was a record that could not be argued away. The bar was exactly where Ruth said it would be, a low building at the bend of Route 9, its sign creaking in the wind like a tired hinge. The Frozen Pint. Garrett had never been inside, but he knew the type. Every small town had one. The placemen went when the day had taken more than they could carry, and the night promised nothing better. He arrived before the dinner rush when the room still held the quiet of a place that had not yet decided what kind of evening it would become. Inside, the air smelled of fried onions and old wood, and the specific sadness of draft beer that had been sitting too long in lines that needed cleaning. The bartender was a broad woman with cropped gray hair and forearms etched by years of lifting kegs. She nodded once at Garrett without asking what he wanted. He took a seat at the far end where he could see the door. Men like Dax Rucker did not arrive quietly. They announced themselves with sound, before presence, with laughter too loud for the size of the room, or silence too heavy to be ignored. Dax came with both. He was in his early 40s, thick through the shoulders from work that had once been honest, but was now softened by nights like this. Stubble of dark beard shadowed a jaw that had forgotten how to be clean, and the scar above his left eyebrow, old and poorly healed, caught the light when he turned his head. His coat was a size too large, the sleeves stained at the cuffs with something that might have been oil or mud or both. When he shook snow from his shoulders, the flakes fell with a kind of resignation, as if even they knew this was not a place where things got better. He did not see Garrett at first. He went to the bar, ordered whiskey, drank half in one swallow that said more about his relationship with the bottle than any words could. Then he turned, eyes narrowing as if the room itself had rearranged while he wasn't looking. Recognition flickered, followed by something harder. He walked over and stopped close enough that Garrett could smell the cold on him, the alcohol riding it like a second breath. "You got my dog." Not a question. Ownership pressed into each syllable like a stamp on paper. Garrett did not rise. He did not offer his hand. He met Dax's stare the way he had met men in other rooms, in other countries, without threat and without apology. "She walked into my cabin in a blizzard," Garrett said evenly, "with 4 puppies, hypothermic." Dax's jaw tightened. "She's mine," he said again, louder this time, as if volume could substitute for proof. "I don't care where she went." Garrett let the words settle. Then he placed his phone on the table between them. Screen dark. His thumb hovered near the record button hidden beneath the edge of his palm. "What you care about isn't the question," Garrett said quietly. "What the law cares about is neglect that puts animals in danger. That's not a gray area." Dax's eyes flicked to the phone, then back to Garrett. He snorted a sound that was half laugh, half challenge. "You think you know what you're talking about?" Garrett kept his voice low. He did not use the tone of command. He used the tone of consequence. "I know what a vet documented this morning. Severe hypothermia, frostbite on ears and paws, old abrasions around her neck." He paused, let the silence work for him. "I know what a warehouse looks like with no heat, frozen water, a chain." Dax's lips curled. He leaned in, whiskey courage making him bolder than wisdom would allow. "I kept them in the shed so they wouldn't run," he said, the words coming out fast, careless, the way truth sometimes does when it believes itself unchallenged. "It was warmer than outside." Garrett's thumb pressed the record button. The icon lit silently. One-party consent. Montana law did not require permission. It required accuracy. Dax continued, emboldened by what he mistook for weakness. "I was going to deal with it when the storm passed," he said, gesturing with the hand that held his glass whiskey sloshing against the rim. "Dogs are tough. She's always been tough. And Councilman Briggs already told me I'm not in violation of anything. He's handled this kind of complaint for me 3 times before. Says he'll make sure it goes away this time too." The name landed between them like a stone dropped into still water. Garrett's expression did not change, but something shifted behind his eyes. Briggs, Porter Briggs, the town councilman who'd been in office for 12 years and had a reputation for getting things done, which was code for making problems disappear if you knew the right people to ask. "They were dying," Garrett said. Dax's eyes flared. "Don't tell me what they were." His voice rose sharp enough that the bartender glanced over, then looked away the way people do when they sense a boundary being tested but do not yet know which side will hold. You don't get to take what's mine. Garrett leaned back slightly, opening the space between them. He did not raise his voice. I'm not taking anything. I'm preventing harm. If you show up at the clinic demanding them back, you will be met with a report, not an argument. Dax laughed sharp, humorless, the sound of a man who had stopped believing in consequences a long time ago. You and your paperwork, he said. He took another swallow of whiskey, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. We'll see. He turned away, leaving the words behind him like spent shells. Garrett did not move until the door slammed and the cold rushed in, then out again. He ended the recording, labeled the file with date and time, and slid the phone into his pocket. His hands were steady, his breathing was controlled. But beneath the calm was something older, something that had learned in Fallujah and Kandahar, that corruption was not a bug in the system, it was a feature, and the only way to fight it was to build a case so airtight that even the men who thought they were above the law had to acknowledge its weight. He left a 20 on the bar for the beer he hadn't ordered and walked out into dusk that had already begun choosing night. The drive back toward town felt longer than it should have. Garrett dialed Dr. Sienna Caldwell first, catching her just as she was closing the clinic for the evening. He summarized quickly without embellishment. The warehouse, Ruth's testimony, the gas station footage, the recording from the bar, including Dax's admission that Briggs had protected him before. Sienna listened without interrupting, and when he finished, there was a pause that felt like someone doing math in their head. That's substantial, she said finally. But if Briggs is involved, this gets complicated. He has friends in the sheriff's office. Then we go around him, Garrett said. County level, animal welfare officer. Warden Hollis, Sienna confirmed. She's good, doesn't owe Briggs anything. Another pause. I'll add the medical documentation to your evidence file. Temperature readings, injury assessment, behavioral observations. Everything dated and time-stamped. Thank you, Garrett said and meant it. Don't thank me yet, Sienna replied. Dax strikes me as the kind of man who doesn't let go easy. She was right. Garrett ended the call and immediately dialed the number Sienna had given him for Warden Hollis. The line rang twice before a woman's voice answered, clear, direct, with the kind of authority that did not need to announce itself. Hollis, Garrett introduced himself, laid out the sequence just as he had for Sienna. The blizzard, the dog at his door, the clinic, the warehouse, the evidence, the recording, including the detail about Briggs's prior interference. Hollis listened with the focused silence of someone trained to parse signal from noise, and when he finished, she spoke without hesitation. That's enough for an emergency hold, she said. We can prevent any removal until a hearing. And if Briggs has been running interference, that's a separate matter I'll need to document. Relief did not rush him. It settled, measured, and deliberate. What do you need from me? Email everything tonight, Hollis said. Photos, audio, witness statement, timeline. Include the detail about Briggs' exact words if you have them. I'll open a case first thing tomorrow and file the petition. If Rutger shows up at the clinic, Dr. Caldwell is not to release the animals. If he comes to you, she stopped, choosing her words carefully. Do not escalate. Document. Garrett glanced at the road ahead. Understood. He ended the call as the last light slipped behind the ridge, turning the valley into a study of shadow and suggestion. They reached the cabin as the first stars pricked the sky, cold and distant and indifferent to the small dramas of men and dogs and the lines they drew between right and wrong. Inside, Garrett lit the stove and fed it until the room warmed. He set his laptop on the table and began the work of turning a night's rescue into a legal record. He uploaded the photographs, the warehouse interior, the frozen bowl, the chain, the scratches on the door. He attached the audio file from the bar, Dax's voice, admitting to keeping the animals in conditions he himself described as inadequate, and the explicit mention that Councilman Briggs had protected him from 3 prior animal welfare complaints. He transcribed Ruth Palmer's statement, her words plain and unadorned, but carrying the weight of truth told by someone with no reason to lie. He wrote the timeline in clean, spare lines. The scratch at his door at 0300, the discovery of hypothermia, the drive to the clinic, the microchip scan, the investigation of the warehouse, the witness interview, the confrontation. Each event marked with time and location, each detail chosen for its ability to withstand scrutiny. By the time he finished, it was past midnight, and his shoulder ached from hours hunched over the keyboard. He hit send, watched the email disappear into the void, and allowed himself one slow breath that tasted like exhaustion and something close to hope. Then movement at the corner of his vision made him turn. The canvas gear bag near the cabin's back wall, the one he hadn't opened in weeks, had shifted slightly, Or maybe it hadn't, and he was just seeing things after a day that had stretched longer than any day should. But when he walked over to check, he found the zipper partly open. And inside, pushed to the bottom beneath rope and tools, he recognized was something that didn't belong. An old leather collar, cracked with age, its metal tag bent at an angle that suggested violence more than wear. The inside edge was dark with a stain that did not belong to rust alone. His breath caught. He hadn't put this here, which meant he turned. The dog stood near the stove, watching him with those same amber eyes that had looked at him from his porch in the blizzard. She held his gaze, unblinking, and there was something in her posture, not pride, not defiance, just a quiet certainty that made everything suddenly terribly clear. "You brought this," he said quietly. Not a question. "From the warehouse, before you came to me." She flicked one ear. Acknowledgement. The tag bore no name. Only a number 17. Garrett knelt, photographed the collar where it lay, careful to capture its position in the bag, the blood on the leather catching the dim light from the laptop screen. Then he bagged it carefully, adding a new paragraph to the email draft for Warden Hollis. Physical evidence recovered from premises suggests prior animals kept under similar conditions. Collar found with number designation rather than name. Appears to have been brought by rescued dog from original location before arrival at my residence. He hit send on the update, then stood slowly, meeting the dog's eyes again. "You knew I'd need this," he said. "Didn't you?" She turned her head toward the window ears, angling forward in a way that made the hair on the back of Garrett's neck stand up. He walked to her side, rested his hand against her shoulder, and listened. Wind, the creak of pine branches bending under snow. And beneath it, distant but unmistakable, the low rumble of an engine struggling up the grade. Garrett moved to the window, staying to the side where he could see without being seen. Headlights appeared between the trees, cutting slow arcs through the dark. One vehicle, then two. They slowed as they approached the turnoff to his cabin, idled there for a long moment, as if deciding, then turned and receded, their lights vanishing behind the ridge like eyes closing. The dog's posture did not change, but her eyes did, narrowing with a focus that was neither fear nor aggression, but something in between. Awareness. Calculation. Garrett did not reach for his weapon. He reached for his phone. He sent a brief message to Warden Hollis. File uploaded. All evidence attached, including recovered collar. Possible surveillance tonight. Vehicles near property. No approach. The reply came back within seconds. Noted. Stay inside. Emergency hold will be filed at 0800. Garrett locked the door, checked the windows, and returned to the stove where the dog had finally settled. She lay near the hearth, her injured legs stretched out carefully, her breathing slow and even. But her eyes stayed open, tracking the room, the shadows, the places where danger might come from next. He sat beside her on the floor, his back against the wall, the Glock within reach, but not in hand. "We're not done," he said softly, "even if it gets harder before it gets easier." She turned her head to look at him, amber eyes catching the firelight, and for a moment he could almost believe she understood. Not the words, but the intent behind them. The promise that he would not let the cold win. Not tonight, not tomorrow, not ever again if he had anything to say about it. Outside, the wind worried the eaves, testing what had been set in place. Inside, the record existed. The call had been made. The night could do what it would. They would answer it with what they had, and in the morning the law would begin to move slowly, deliberately, with the patient weight of a thing that once set in motion was very hard to stop. Morning came without ceremony, the kind of pale northern light that made snow look less like burden and more like possibility. Garrett woke to the sound of his phone buzzing on the table. A text from Warden Hollis sent at precisely 8 o'clock. "Emergency hold filed. Hearing scheduled 48 hours. Standby." He read it twice, let the words settle into the space between what had been feared and what was now fait accompli, and allowed himself the luxury of a full breath that did not carry the weight of waiting. The dog, he had started calling her Ember in his head, though he hadn't said it aloud yet, raised her head from where she'd been sleeping near the stove, ears pricked forward as if she too understood that something had shifted in the night. The temporary hearing took place in the White Ridge Town Hall, a building that had served as courthouse, community center, and polling station for the better part of a century. Its walls held the accumulated gravity of decisions made and lives altered, and when Garrett walked through the double doors with Ember at his side, he felt the weight of that history press against his shoulders, like hands testing whether he was strong enough to carry what came next. The room had been arranged for function rather than theater. Folding chairs formed neat rows facing a long table at the front, cleared of everything except a gavel, a digital recorder, and a stack of manila folders that Warden Hollis was methodically organizing with the precision of someone who understood that details were the difference between justice and its counterfeit. Hollis herself was exactly as Garrett had imagined. From her voice, 52 years old with short blonde hair, going silver at the temples, eyes the color of winter sky, and the weathered skin of someone who had spent more time outdoors than in. She wore a county uniform that was pressed, but not pristine practical boots that had seen mud and snow and worse, and an expression that suggested she had no patience for nonsense, but infinite patience for truth. She nodded at Garrett when he entered. "Mr. Ashford, good to put a face to the voice." Sienna arrived moments later in a charcoal coat leather portfolio in hand. When she met Garrett's eyes across the room, there was quiet solidarity. Two people standing on the same side of a line not everyone could see. Ruth Palmer sat in the third row, hands folded in her lap, dressed as if for church because the moment demanded it, even if the room did not. A handful of town residents had taken seats as well, their faces familiar from the general store, and the post office people who had heard something through the grapevine about a bon and a blizzard, and a man who had decided that enough was finally enough. Dax Rucker arrived late, coat still dusted with snow, jaw set in a way that looked less like resolve than refusal. He took his seat without meeting anyone's eyes, the scar above his brow catching the fluorescent light for a moment before the room settled into the weighted quiet that precedes judgment. Judge Catherine Brennan entered from a side door, and the room rose automatically, the old ritual of respect offered to the office, if not always the person. She was in her early 50s, with hair pulled into a severe bun that made no concessions to softness, and lines at the corners of her eyes that spoke of long days spent reading fine print, and longer nights spent wondering if she had made the right call. Her voice when she spoke carried the evenness of someone who did not mistake neutrality for indifference. "This is a temporary hearing regarding the custody and welfare of one adult canine and 4 puppies," she said, settling into her chair with the deliberate movements of someone conserving energy for the decisions that actually mattered. "The question before us is not ownership in perpetuity, but immediate safety. Warden Hollis, you may proceed." Hollis stood, opened the first folder, and began to lay out the case with the methodical care of someone building a bridge one stone at a time, each placed where it could bear weight without shifting. She presented the photographs of the warehouse interior, first the images appearing on a screen that had been set up to the judge's left. Straw matted with damp, a metal bowl encased in ice. The chain mounted to the wall, rust eating through links that had once been meant to restrain. Temperature readings taken at the site, time-stamped and geotagged, showing -10°C, in a structure with no insulation, no heat, no capacity to sustain life, in conditions that made death the more probable outcome. Next came the medical reports from Sienna, read aloud in her steady voice. "Severe hypothermia in all 4 puppies, core temperatures between 34 and 35°C, when normal should have been 38 to 39. Early frostbite on ears and paws. Old abrasions around the mother's neck, consistent with prolonged restraint by a collar that had been too tight for too long. Dehydration, exhaustion, a sprained foreleg that suggested injury compounded by overuse." Ruth Palmer's statement was read next, her own words simple and unadorned. "The nights, the sounds, the soup left untouched. The certainty that something was wrong even when no one else seemed to notice or care." The leather collar came out of its evidence bag, held up for the judge to see, cracked and stiff with dried blood, the metal tag bearing only the number 17, as if the life it had encircled was inventory rather than being. Hollis explained how it had been recovered from Mr. Ashford's premises, apparently brought there by the rescued animal herself before she arrived at his door. Finally, the gas station footage, grainy but unmistakable. Dax Rucker at the counter at 0017 on January 15th, purchasing whiskey during a blizzard, while animals under his care froze in a building he had admitted on recording was inadequate, but which he had deemed sufficient because dogs are tough, and she's always been tough. The audio played in the quiet room, Dax's voice rendered flat and tinny by the phone's microphone, but still carrying the weight of admission. "I kept them in the shed so they wouldn't run. It was warmer than outside. I was going to deal with it when the storm passed, and Councilman Briggs already told me I'm not in violation of anything. He's handled this kind of complaint for me 3 times before." When the recording ended, the silence that followed had texture. It pressed against eardrums and made people shift in their seats, looking for space that was no longer there. Judge Brennan leaned forward slightly, her fingers steepled beneath her chin. "Mr. Rucker, do you wish to respond?" Dax stood with the stiffness of a man who had rehearsed his defense in the quiet places of his mind and found it lacking when spoken aloud. "They're my dogs," he said, and his voice carried the hollow ring of a truth that was factually correct, but morally bankrupt. "I didn't mean for it to get that bad. The storm came faster than I expected. I thought they'd be fine." "You thought wrong," Judge Brandon said, and there was no heat in her voice, only the cold clarity of cause meeting consequence. "The standard before this court today is immediate welfare. Whether these animals are safer in your custody or elsewhere, the evidence presented suggests elsewhere." Dax opened his mouth to respond, then closed it. His lawyer, if he had one, was conspicuously absent, which told Garrett everything he needed to know about how seriously Dax had taken this proceeding. It was then that Ember did something that would later be recounted in the general store and the diner and the bar, where men gathered to turn events into legend. She rose slowly from where she had been lying at Garrett's feet, mindful of her bandaged leg, and took 2 measured steps forward into the space between the gallery and the judge's bench. She did not bark. She did not growl. She lifted her muzzle and looked at Judge Brennan with amber eyes that held no plea, only the steady gaze of a creature who had survived something she should not have survived and was asking without words whether the world would see her or look away. "Will you see what is already here?" The room seemed to hold its breath. Garrett's hand hovered near her collar, ready to guide her back if needed. But Judge Brennan raised one finger not to command, but to acknowledge, and said softly, "It's all right." Ember stopped where she was, a quiet center in a room full of human language, and the moment passed without spectacle. But something in it rearranged the space. People would later say they could not explain why that single wordless act had mattered. They would only say that it had. Judge Brennan returned her attention to the papers before her, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of finality. "Emergency custody is granted to White Ridge Animal Shelter under the supervision of Dr. Sienna Caldwell. A no-contact provision is hereby issued, preventing Mr. Rutger from approaching the animals or the shelter. A full hearing on permanent custody will be scheduled within 3 weeks. This court is adjourned." There was no gavel strike that sounded like triumph. There was only the steady cadence of a system doing what it had been built to do when it chose not to look away. Relief arrived not in a rush but in increments. Sienna closing her eyes for a heartbeat before opening them again. Hollis exhaling through her nose in a way that suggested satisfaction without celebration. Ruth pressing her lips together as if holding something precious that might escape if she opened her mouth. Garrett felt it settle into his chest like warmth returning to fingers that had forgotten what warmth felt like. Dax remained standing for a beat longer, as if waiting for the words to change their meaning. When they did not, he sat heavily, and the sound his body made against the chair was the sound of a man whose world had just contracted in ways he had not seen coming. Outside, the yellow light fell across the steps, turning snow into something almost tender. The townspeople filtered out in quiet groups, no cheers, no declarations, just the shared sense that something right had been done without needing to be celebrated. A woman adjusted a scarf around another's neck. A man held the door for an elderly couple navigating ice with careful steps. Garrett walked into the cold with Ember at his side. She leaned briefly into his leg, not as display, but as fact, and he rested his hand against the warm plane of her shoulder, feeling the steady thrum of life beneath fur and muscle and bone. "This is just the beginning," he murmured. She flicked one ear as if agreeing with the part of the sentence that mattered most. The weeks that followed took on a rhythm that felt less like waiting and more like building. Garrett returned to his cabin and began the work of transforming a temporary refuge into something that might last. Just. He installed a low fence around the perimeter, not to keep things in, but to mark the boundaries of a place where safety was more than theory. He replaced the harsh bulb over the porch with a softer fixture that cast steady amber light across the snow, not to announce anything, but to make the night feel navigable. He built insulated shelters for the puppies as they grew, sturdy structures with heated floors and ventilation that kept the air from going stale. He set up water bowls that would not freeze, positioned where they caught sunlight during the brief hours when the sun remembered to show itself. Sienna came most mornings before the clinic opened her truck, crunching up the gravel drive just as the sky began to lighten. She brought medical supplies and expertise, but more than that, she brought the steady presence of someone who understood that recovery was not a straight line, but a series of small, faithful circles. She checked the puppy's weight, their reflexes, the way their eyes tracked movement, and their ears swiveled towards sound. She redressed Ember's leg until the day came when the bandage could finally come off for good, revealing pink, new skin where the sprain had healed and muscles that had remembered how to bear weight without flinching. They spoke little when work was needed and laughed easily when it was not. Sienna had a way of moving through space that was both efficient and unhurried, as if she had learned the trick of doing 2 things at once without doing either of them poorly. Garrett found himself watching her, sometimes the way she tilted her head when listening to a heartbeat through her stethoscope, the way she tucked strands of escaping hair behind her ear with the back of her wrist, because her hands were always occupied with something that mattered more than vanity. There was no romance between them. Neither of them had the bandwidth for that particular complication, and both of them were too honest to pretend otherwise. But there was respect, and in its own way, that was worth more. Respect was what you built things on when passage had burned itself out, and all that remained was the choice to keep showing up. The puppies grew into themselves the way all living things do when they are allowed to without spectacle, with an inevitability that felt like grace. Ash, the one with the dark blaze along his spine, took to the gate as if it were a vocation. He would sit squarely whenever anyone approached, not with aggression, but with the seriousness of a sentinel who had decided that presence itself was protection. Maple, the smallest, never lost her talent for mischief. If there was a boot, she would find it. If there was a glove, it would disappear. She carried her stolen treasures with a triumph entirely out of proportion to their value, and dropped them at Garrett's feet as if to say, "I have saved this for you," and he would accept them gravely because that was what you did when someone offered you their best. Ridge all angles and curiosity learned every corner of the property, nose mapping the world in a language only he could read. And Clover, quietest of the four, followed Ember's shadow with the devotion of a tide to the moon, never straying far, always watching, always learning what it meant to be the kind of creature who kept others safe. Ember herself changed in ways both visible and subtle. Her coat regained its depth, the black and sable catching light again, where it had been dulled by cold and neglect. The scar around her neck faded beneath new fur, and though it would never fully disappear, it became something she carried rather than something that carried her. She moved with a confidence that had nothing to do with forgetting and everything to do with choosing each morning, each moment, to believe that this place, these people, this strange man with the quiet voice and the steady hands would not become another thing she had to survive. She had a habit of stopping at the edge of the clearing and lifting her muzzle to taste the air, her whole body going still in a way that suggested focus rather than fear. Garrett called it counting the weather, though he suspected it was more than that. If she paused, he paused. If she turned, he followed. He had learned to trust what she knew before he knew it, and that trust was repaid in the small ways that mattered: a low growl when someone approached the property line, a gentle pressure of her body against his leg when the nightmares woke him at hours that had no names. People began to arrive. Not in crowds, White Ridge was not built for that, and neither was Garrett, but in careful intervals. A woman who had lost a dog to the cold years before and could not pass the fence without stopping to watch the puppies play. A father who brought his son to help refill water troughs because the boy had asked what it meant to be useful. A Sunday school teacher who requested permission to bring her class one afternoon so they could learn what care looked like when it was chosen rather than mandated. Garrett did not advertise. He did not need to. Word traveled the way it always had, in small places, on boots, in kitchens, along the lines between what had happened and what could happen again if no one paid attention. He kept a board by the door where Sienna wrote schedules and notes, her handwriting neat and efficient, except when she was amused, at which point it tilted sideways as if the humor could not be contained by straight lines. On one entry, in a hand that pretended to be stern and was not, she had written, "Teach Maple to stop stealing shoes, priority very high." Garrett circled it and wrote "impossible" beside it in block letters. The board became a ledger of both work and laughter, a record of days when nothing dramatic happened, and that itself was the miracle. The White Ridge Thaw Festival arrived in late March like a promise kept. It was a modest affair, booths selling soup and bread that steamed in the cold air, children dragging sleds they no longer needed across patches of bare ground, a brass band that never quite found the same tempo twice, but played with enough heart to make up for what they lacked in precision. The lake at the center of town had begun its annual transformation from solid ice to treacherous slush, the surface mottled with dark patches where water pressed up from below, like a secret trying to surface. Garrett had not planned to attend. Crowds still made something in him, close, a reflex that belonged to a life he no longer lived but could not entirely set down. But Sienna insisted, pressing a thermos of coffee into his hands with an expression that suggested refusal was not actually an option. "You can't protect a place you never step into," she said. He went. Ember trotted beside him through the gathering ash and ridge on leads, because they were still learning what boundaries meant, while Maple zigzagged like a ribbon in the wind, and Clover stayed glued to Ember's flank as if connected by invisible thread. People smiled. Some waved. A few reached out and stopped themselves, asking, first with their eyes, before extending a hand towards soft fur, learning that permission was a kind of respect, and respect was something you practiced even when, especially when it cost you nothing. They were near the shore when Ember stiffened. Not the alert of a guard dog catching scent of an intruder. Not the curiosity of a hunter spotting prey. Something sharper, cleaner. Her body went taut in a way that made the hair on Garrett's arms stand up beneath his jacket, and before he could process what was happening, she was moving forward with a decisiveness that parted the small knots of people without urgency, but without hesitation either. Garrett felt the tug on the lead and followed his body, remembering what it meant to trust a signal you did not fully understand. At the water's edge, the ice had thinned into a treacherous skin, translucent, where winter had lost its argument, but not yet its hold. A boy stood there, 8 years old, maybe 9, wearing a red knit cap too big for his head and a coat that suggested someone who loved him had dressed him that morning. He was peering down at the dark water beneath the surface, fascinated by the way light refracted through ice, oblivious to the fact that the ground beneath his boots was no longer ground at all, but a membrane between solid and liquid, between here and gone. Before anyone could speak, Ember surged not into the water, but across the narrow strip of shoreline, placing herself between the child and the edge, with a precision that felt less like instinct and more like geometry solved in real time. She barked once, a single commanding sound that cut through the chatter and the music and the ambient noise of a town enjoying itself. The boy, startled, stepped back, and the ice gave way where his foot had been a second before. It did not swallow him because he was no longer there. He stumbled into his mother's arms, a woman named Lisa Brennan, who turned out to be Judge Catherine Brennan's younger sister, and the child began to cry the way children do when fear catches up to what almost happened, but did not. Everything that followed happened in that narrow corridor of time where shock had not yet given way to gratitude. A shout, a rush of bodies, arms lifting the boy away from the edge. The ice continuing its slow fracture, dark water licking at the broken edges like a tongue tasting what it had been denied. Lisa clutched her son to her chest, hands shaking, tears arriving without ceremony. And when she looked up at Garrett, at Ember standing calm and watchful beside him, her voice broke on a single word. Thank you. Garrett shook his head. Thank her. The town did not make a spectacle of the moment. It did not need to. Stories, when they are true, do not require embellishment. By evening, the mayor had found Sienna at one of the soup booths and asked about the sanctuary. By the end of the week, the town council had placed an item on their agenda: winter welfare guidelines for animals. Windbreaks, unfrozen water, emergency checks during storms. A fund followed, small at first, hesitant in the way that good intentions often are before they find their footing, then steadier as people realized that money spent on heated water bowls and insulated shelters was money spent on the kind of town they wanted to live in. The kind where you did not look away when something needed doing. Garrett watched it unfold with the quiet awe of someone who had seen how little it sometimes took to begin a change and how much it took to keep one. He did not take credit. Credit was not the point. The point was that a dog had saved a child, and the child's mother had told her sister, the judge, and the judge had spoken to the mayor, and the mayor had done what good mayors do when they are reminded that leadership is not about making noise, but about making things better. Spring settled in with a patience that felt earned. The snow retreated to shadows. The ground showed through in dark, honest patches. The creek ran loud with meltwater, and at night the sound of it was like a promise that winter had been survived and what came next might actually be worth the effort. The permanent custody hearing arrived on a Thursday in late April, and this time the courtroom was fuller. Town residents who had heard the story. The Sunday school teacher, Lisa Brennan, with her son Tommy, who waved shyly at Ember when they entered. Ruth Palmer in the third row, again hands folded, eyes bright with the particular satisfaction of someone who had done the right thing and was about to see it honored. Warden Hollis presented the follow-up report with the same methodical care she had brought to the first hearing. Medical recovery records showing all 4 puppies now at healthy weights, vaccinations, complete behavioral development on track. Behavioral assessments from Sienna, noting Ember's stability, her capacity for training, her protective instincts that were asset rather than liability. The lake incident, documented by 3 witnesses, including Lisa Brennan herself, who testified tearfully that she did not know what would have happened if the dog had not been there. Garrett submitted his proposal for White Ridge Sanctuary, a formal plan outlining capacity funding, volunteer structure, partnership with Sienna's Clinic for medical oversight. It was not fancy. It was not going to change the world. But it was going to change the world for the animals who came through its doors, and sometimes that was enough. Sienna confirmed the viability of the plan. Hollis confirmed that no further complaints had been filed and that Dax Rucker had complied with the no-contact order. The prosecution rested. When it was Dax's turn to speak, he stood without lawyer or defense, and for the first time since this had begun, he looked less like a man preparing to fight and more like a man preparing to let go. "I didn't know it was that bad," he said quietly. "Not until it was too late. The bottle made things smaller than they should have been. Made me think I could handle what I couldn't." He paused, swallowed. "I'm not asking for them back. I'm just asking that someone take better care of them than I did." It was not an eloquent apology. It was not enough to undo what had been done. But it was not empty either. The room held his words without judgment, and in that holding was the space for something like redemption, not granted, not denied, just acknowledged as possible. Judge Brennan did not deliberate long. Permanent custody of the adult canine known as Ember and her 4 offspring is granted to White Ridge Sanctuary under the joint supervision of Garrett Ashford and Dr. Sienna Caldwell. Mr. Rucker is prohibited from owning or possessing animals for a period of 5 years and is ordered to complete 200 hours of community service to be performed at the sanctuary under the supervision and to participate in a court-approved substance rehabilitation program. Judge Brennan paused, shuffled papers, then continued with a weight that silenced the room. Additionally, this court has forwarded evidence of interference by Councilman Porter Briggs to the State Ethics Commission. Records show Mr. Briggs intervened in 3 prior animal welfare complaints against Mr. Rucker between 23 and 2025, preventing investigation. The matter is now under criminal review for obstruction of justice. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Ruth Palmer's eyes widened. Garrett felt Sienna's sharp intake of breath beside him. "This court," Judge Brennan said, her voice steel-wrapped in velvet, "will not tolerate corruption that enables harm. Not today. Not ever." She looked at Dax directly. "You made mistakes, Mr. Rutger. The question now is whether you learn from them. The court hopes you will." There was no gavel strike that felt like victory. There was only the sound of words becoming structure, and in that structure, the foundation for what came next. Adoption Day arrived in early May with the kind of sunshine that made people believe in second chances. Ash went to Sarah Whitfield, the Sunday school teacher, who saw in his protective instincts the makings of a therapy dog for her students. Maple went to the Watson family, a couple with 2 young children, who laughed when she immediately stole a slipper and decided that anyone who could find joy in chaos was exactly the kind of family they wanted to be. Ridge went to Lisa Brennan as a gift for Tommy, a way of saying thank you that came with 4 legs and a tail that never stopped wagging. And Clover stayed because some bonds were too strong to ask breaking, and Ember had made it clear through every movement and glance that this one was hers to keep. Garrett built the sanctuary properly over the summer, solid fencing, insulated kennels, a small office where Sienna could do intake exams, and he could keep records that would satisfy the county inspectors. They painted a sign together one Saturday afternoon, Sienna's handwriting, "Careful and deliberate, White Ridge Sanctuary, where second chances begin." Volunteers came. Teenagers looking for service hours, retirees looking for purpose. Dax Rucker showing up every Saturday morning at 8 sharp to muck kennels and haul supplies and do the work of atonement without asking for credit or acknowledgement. Garrett watched him sometimes, this man who had caused so much harm, learning to be useful, and wondered if maybe that was what redemption actually looked like. Not a single dramatic moment of change, but the accumulation of days where you chose differently and kept choosing until the choosing itself became who you were. On a Saturday evening in October, as the leaves turned gold and the air carried the first hint of cold that would eventually become winter again, Garrett stood on his porch with Ember and Clover at his feet. The new light glowed warm overhead, spilling amber across the path that led to the sanctuary, and in the distance, the town of White Ridge sat like a scatter of stars against the darkening valley. Ember lifted her head, looked toward the town one last time, then turned back to Garrett and pressed her muzzle against his wrist. Not marking this time, not asking, just resting there in a gesture that felt like coming home. He thought of Daniel, of the words, "Don't let it be meaningless, brother," and how he had carried them like a stone in his chest for 5 years, never quite knowing what to do with the weight. He understood now. Meaning was not something you found. It was something you made, one decision at a time, one open door at a time, one life saved because you chose to answer when the cold came knocking. "It's not meaningless," he said quietly. "Not anymore." Maple appeared at the edge of the porch carrying a boot she had liberated from somewhere she absolutely should not have been. She dropped it at Garrett's feet, sat with exaggerated seriousness, and looked up at him with eyes that sparkled with pride. Garrett laughed, a sound that surprised him with its ease. Good girl. The camera of memory pulled back then, widening to take in the whole of it. The cabin with its amber light. The sanctuary sign catching the last of the sun. The town below where new ordinances protected animals through winters that would always come, but no longer had to be survived alone. The stars beginning to appear overhead, cold and distant, but somehow less indifferent than they used to be. And in that moment, in that light, with a boy who had chosen him and a purpose he had stumbled into, in a town that had decided collective care was worth the effort, Garrett Ashford felt something he had not felt since the day Daniel died. He felt like maybe he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Sometimes miracles come on four tired paws in the coldest hour. They scratch at doors we did not know needed opening. They ask us to be better than we believed we could be. And if we are lucky, if we are paying attention, we answer. Not because it is easy, but because it is right. And in the choosing and the answering, in the steady accumulation of small acts done well, we find that meaning was never something lost. It was only waiting to be claimed. The light stayed on through the night. It would stay on through many nights to come. A beacon for the lost, a promise for the found, a reminder that in a world that could be cold and cruel and indifferent, there were still people who chose warmth. And sometimes that was enough to change everything.